Hello, I'm going to be doing a lecture on the September-October topic for Lincoln Douglas debate, which is all about compulsory voting. This is the first time that I've done one of these, and the recording software that I'm using, Loom, is also new to me, so we'll see how it goes. I intend this to be a resource for pretty much anyone, but I'm specifically doing it for people that are debating in Idaho, because I feel like the number of YouTube resources, or just resources in general for Idaho debaters, is pretty small compared to a lot of bigger debate areas. So with that being said, let's go ahead and hop right into the lecture. So the first thing that I want to do is break down the wording of the topic, which reads, "Resolved, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory." So first, let's break down in a democracy. Merriam-Webster defines democracy as a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Now, what does that mean? It means that this resolution is all about countries where the government structure resembles the one in the definition. Lots of countries might call themselves democracies, but because they don't actually meet this definition, I think for the purpose of this debate, which is about a hypothetical society that resembles this state of government, then those examples don't really count. Additionally, that means that the resolution is about any potential society that has, or any potential government structure that resembles a democracy. It doesn't just have to be a gigantic country, it could be a smaller country, or it could even be an individual state or town that has a government that meets this definition of democracy. The next phrase that I want to break down is ought to be. Now, Merriam-Webster provides a bunch of different definitions of ought, and ought is in pretty much every single Lincoln Douglas topic that I can remember. It gives four main definitions: used to express obligation, used for advisability, natural expectation, and logical consequence. Most LD resolutions that use the word ought are looking at number one or number two, used to express obligation. We have all heard, like, ought implies a moral obligation, therefore the value is going to be morality, or something like that. However, this resolution, if you look at how it's phrased, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory, resembles the third and fourth definition, natural expectation, with the example ought to be here by now, or logical consequence, the result ought to be infinity. So what do these things mean? Combined with the previous phrase, in a democracy, the topic is essentially saying it would make sense for democratic governments to, or it would line up with the purpose of a democratic government, or it would essentially, again, make sense for a democratic government to the rest of the resolution. So the third part that I want to break down is voting compulsory, i.e. compulsory voting. Now, according to the Idea Institute, most democratic governments consider participating in national elections to be a right of citizenship. Some consider that participation at elections is also a citizen's civic responsibility. In some countries where voting is considered a duty, voting at elections has been made compulsory and has been regulated in the national constitutions and electoral laws. Some countries go as far to impose sanctions on non-voters. Basically, compulsory voting means that voting is required of all citizens who are eligible to vote. So in the United States, if you're over the age of 18 and you're not a felon, and in some states if you have an ID, you are allowed to vote. If voting were made compulsory, anyone who met that definition would instead be required to vote by law. So when we put it all together, there are three different types of propositions, or which we call topics and resolutions. There's policy propositions, which are an actor should action. There's value, which can look like X is good, or X is preferable to Y, or X meets this standard. And then there's fact topics, which are X is true and X will happen. Now, a lot of the times people think that all of PF debate is fact resolutions, and all of LD debate and value, and all of policy is policy. But more and more frequently, LD and PF are having more policy-type propositions. So this full resolution reads, in a democracy, voting ought to be compulsory, and that doesn't look like it fits directly into any of the three above categories. I think that it fits best into policy and value, but more so policy. And the reason why is that it has all of the essential ingredients of a policy resolution, even if it's not ordered in that exact way. So in a democracy says the actor would essentially be a democratic government or a democratic society. Ought to be is the LD way of saying should, and then voting compulsory is the action that democratic government should take. You could also argue that it's the third type of value motion, that voting ought to be compulsory represents X, and in a democracy would tell us that the standard is principles of democratic governance. I think that one's a bit more of a stretch, but it's also more akin to traditional LD being about values debate. So why does this matter? If you view the resolution as more of a proposition of policy, then the affirmative might need to make solvency arguments that will be able to prove the impacts of their contention are actually going to happen as a result of implementing compulsory voting. The affirmative might also get to read advantages of immediately implementing it. Like, for example, the US has an election coming up soon. Making compulsory voting happen now might be good for XYZ reason, and you could use that as a reason to affirm. On the other hand, if it's policy, the negative gets to make solvency arguments, and the negative might get to read disadvantages of doing this immediately, such as if we implemented mandatory voting now, maybe it would increase the number of people voting in person, and that could be bad because of the coronavirus. If you frame it more like it's a value proposition, then the affirmative might not need as much solvency or feasibility, and they could avoid some real-world examples of countries that have implemented this, and instead just argue, I'm talking about the idea of compulsory voting, or the philosophy behind it, rather than what it's looked like when it's been done before. But the negative also would gain access to more persuasive versions of like freedom and autonomy arguments, whereas their other arguments about real-world implementation would become less persuasive. In my opinion, debaters should not try and avoid doing one of the other. I think that if you try to do all policy all the time on this topic, then you're not really staying to the heart of LD. But I think that if you ignore the important policy questions about compulsory voting, then your philosophical value-based discussion isn't going to be as good. So I think that you should be trying to incorporate policy and value elements into this topic, but if you're only going to do one or the other, you need to be prepared on the framework level of debate to defend why you think this topic should be treated exclusively policy or exclusively value. So now that we understand what the topic is saying, we're going to move on to discussing the background or how the topic got here, essentially. There are 23 countries that currently have compulsory voting. Only 15 really enforce it, and 8 do not enforce it. Enforce meaning if you do not vote, they have a penalty, and you are likely to experience that penalty. So I'm not going to read every single country. You can pause the video and look at these. The only one that I want to specifically point out is North Korea, because that shocks a lot of people. Everyone over the age of 17 in North Korea has to vote, but there's only one candidate on the ballot, and the purpose of voting isn't actually to determine who's in government. It's more of like a census almost, to determine who is and who is not in the country. And if you vote for somebody who's not the person the only choice, then there can actually be some consequences. Also, if you go back to in a democracy, because the resolution doesn't specify a specific country, but rather a government structure that resembles the definition of democracy, I would argue even if North Korea has compulsory voting, they're not really relevant under the topic. I also think that you can have definition debates on if you're going to enforce it or not. Does that still count as compulsory voting? Like the fact that these 8 countries don't enforce it, is it even compulsory? And I think that could be a good debate to be had. There are some common themes between the countries that have compulsory voting and enforce it. The first one, and this all comes from the Idea Institute, is that it becomes voluntary in a lot of these countries once you reach a certain age, usually between 65 and 75. And there are also 5 commonly used ways to enforce, if you're going to enforce compulsory voting. Number 1 is you have to provide an explanation if you have a valid reason. A valid reason could be you were outside of the country on travel, or you were sick, stuff like that. If that doesn't suffice, then countries can impose fines where you have to pay a certain amount of money, and the amount of money differs between the different countries like Australia and Argentina. Third is going to prison. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that there are cases where countries have put you in prison directly for not voting, but if you are fined and cannot afford to pay that fine, then you could be put in prison. So it's kind of like a part B to the fine reason for enforcing. There's also a lot of different examples that have been grouped together of basically infringing upon different civil rights. Like if you can't prove that you voted within the past couple months, then you might be prevented from getting like goods and services in Peru. You might not be allowed to register for the next election in Singapore. In Bolivia, if you can't prove that you participated, then you might not be able to get your wages or your salary from the bank. And then there are a couple other weird ones, like in Belgium, it's difficult to get a job, and in Mexico, you might not be able to get government services like childcare. So this is currently how it's enforced, but because the resolution does not specify a specific country actor, I think that you don't have to use all of these as an enforcement mechanism. You could also come up with your own, but this just mostly gives you some ideas. Now, why does the way that it is enforced matter? And I think it's because every affirmative needs to be able to answer and cross-ex if they're going to defend enforcing or punishing people who don't vote. If the affirmative says no, then that's good because you don't have to defend against specific disadvantages that might come from the enforcement mechanism you would have chosen, but it's going to be much more difficult to prove that you can actually solve your contentions, because is it really compulsory if nobody's going to come after you if you aren't going to be punished for not voting? If you do say yes, then it's going to be a lot easier to prove solvency for your impacts, but you're going to have to defend which enforcement mechanism you choose, and the enforcement mechanism you have definitely is going to have some sort of drawback. If you defend that you're going to enforce, I think you have three main options. You can be vague and just say, here's what a lot of other countries do. I'm not going to tell you what every single democratic country in the world would do, but here's what they could do. You can be a little bit more specific and say, I approve of these methods and not these methods, but I'm still going to let countries choose for themselves. Or you could be hyper-specific, basically read a plan and say, each country that implemented this would follow this enforcement mechanism. I don't think that you have to defend the enforcement mechanisms that are currently being used. I think that you could come up with some of your own, for example, community service, denial of government services, losing out on tax breaks, things like that. But no matter what you pick, if you pick one, you need to be ready to defend it. If you're on the negative, on the other hand, if the affirmative isn't going to defend an enforcement mechanism, I think that you could make a topicality argument about the fact that it's not really compulsory if there's no punishment. I think that you can make lots of great analytical solvency arguments, and I think that you could talk about how voter turnout in the countries that don't enforce it isn't that much better than countries that don't have it at all, so the likelihood the AF would solve is very low. If they will defend an enforcement mechanism, you could make the argument that, oh, it's LD and you shouldn't actually read a plan. I'm not the biggest fan of that argument, but it's an argument that you can make on the neg. The neg could also read contentions or maybe just turns against the affirmative case that say your specific enforcement mechanism is bad. And you could also cross-apply to countries that currently use those enforcement mechanisms and say, hey, they did it, here's what happened, that was bad. On the other hand, if the AF uses an enforcement mechanism that isn't currently being used, you can say that means you have no evidence that that enforcement mechanism would work, because we've never seen a country actually use it and have it work. Now that we've gone over that, I want to move on to affirmative value premises and criterions, because I think that before we talk about the contentions that you want to read, we need to talk about the framework that you're going to use, because that's the ultimate purpose that your contentions are serving. They are just the way that we get from your value and criterion to the resolution. So the first value I think is pretty obvious that the AF could read, and that is democracy. I really like Cambridge Dictionary's definition of democracy for values, and that is the belief in freedom and equality between people, or a system of government based in this belief. The reasons why I think that this is a good value for this topic is the topic essentially sets it up as the most important value. I think a lot of judges will be persuaded by the fact that democracy is in the topic, therefore it's the most important thing. It's also going to be really easy to connect most of your contentions back to democracy as the overall value, but on the cons, it's pretty basic. It's not going to get you any points for creativity. Everyone should be prepared to answer democracy as a value, and it's also vague. A lot of people will say democracy is just a type of government, it's not a specific value, which is why I think if you're going to read this as a value, using a definition like the Cambridge one is really persuasive, because it says it's a belief in freedom and equality between people, and that's more of a value than like a government structure. The second value that I think that the AF could use is governmental legitimacy. According to Encyclopedia Britannica, governmental legitimacy is the popular acceptance of a government. The word legitimacy can be interpreted in a normative or positive way. The first meaning deals with questions such as what are the right sources of legitimacy? Is a specific political order or regime worthy of recognition? The second meaning relies on empirical approaches that try to measure the degree of popular acceptance of existing regimes, or to try and test causal explanations of the highs and lows degrees of legitimacy. So pros, this is a good value because you can argue that not all democracies are legitimate, guaranteed, but compulsory voting would make them more legitimate. I also think that you could make it really easy to explain with the second interpretation, the positive one. How can we know if there's popular acceptance of a government if the vast majority of citizens aren't voting in their elections? Or even in a country like the US where we have 58% voter turnout, that means that whoever wins our elections did not get voted for by 51% of the overall population or more. So I think you can argue it's impossible to determine if a government is legitimate if people aren't voting for that government. The cons of this is that unlike democracy, it's not not directly in the topic, and I think that it's easily turned compared to democracy on the other side, that you can say a government that forces its citizens to vote for them means that you can't really prove whether or not it's legitimate. You're essentially saying citizens don't have a choice on whether or not they think that government is legitimate, and I think that could be a persuasive argument to read on the negative. The third and final value that I want to talk about, obviously there are more values than just these three, but I think these are the best three, or the three that come to mind when I was approaching the topic, is societal welfare, and Lexico defines that as the well-being of a community or society. Pros, this is going to be really good for the AFs that want to be a little bit more policy, that are going to defend impacts of implementation, and it's also going to be great for arguments about inequality, because you can say if it's the overall well-being of the entire society, if some people are being discriminated against, then the well-being of the overall society is not being achieved. The cons are the fact that societal welfare is really vague, and you could argue that almost any other value is an aspect of societal welfare, and it's not inherently rooted within the topic. But I think you could argue that it is rooted in the topic because it says in a democracy. In a democracy implies a democratic society, not necessarily governments that are democracies, or democratic countries. So I think you should say a democracy is just a specific type of society, therefore this is rooted in the topic. So as far as value criterions goes, over the summer I've done a lot of work trying to better understand value criterions. I read a lot of old school LD textbooks, and the way that it's been explained now that it makes sense to me is that your criterion is just a specific aspect of your value that is specifically connected to the topic. So if the value was education and the topic was about increasing funding, your criterion could be better test scores, better mental health outcomes, people getting into college more frequently, better harmony in the classroom. All of those criterions are specific aspects of the overall value of education, but you would say this criterion is the part of my value that links back over to the overall resolution. So that's the way that I'm approaching this for criterions. If you want to approach it differently, or if your coach wants you to approach it differently, you should default to what they're saying. This is just a suggestion. So for democracy, I think that you could read criterions like increasing voter participation, promoting majority rule, and equality in participation, and then each of your contentions, depending on which one of those criterions you'd use, would be a specific example of how making voting compulsory would result in your criterion, or is an example of your criterion. For governmental legitimacy, you could talk about eliminating corruption, creating the consent of the governed, or like social contract theory, where you essentially say a government is only legitimate if the citizens are upholding their end of the bargain, which is recognizing the authority of the government, and the fact that so few people are voting for our leaders means that citizens are not upholding their end and actually recognizing the government's authority. And then lastly, on societal welfare, I think promoting equality and progressive change are really good, because you can say that a society only has general well-being if everyone has access to that well-being, or you could say that the society can only get better if there are changes that are made that make it better. So now that we've gone over value criterion type arguments for the AF, I want to get into contentions that essentially are reasons why voting ought to be made compulsory in a democracy. So the first argument that I want to talk about is voter turnout. I think that this is the bread and butter argument for the AF. I think every AF case is going to have this, and probably should have this in their AC, just because it's really the biggest justification as to why anyone, anywhere has implemented compulsory voting. I think that there's a lot of different flavors of it, and if you're just using voter turnout in general, that's not going to be persuasive, and generic neg blocks are going to be able to beat that. I think there are two different camps. There's like principle-based arguments about why increasing voter turnout is good, like how you can't really have consent to the governed if the governed aren't voting, or you can't have majority rule if the majority isn't making decisions. It's like 30% of the 50% that are actually voting. 30% of the overall population is not a majority. You could also argue that it prevents aristocracy, where the elites get to run everything, where right now, because not everybody votes, there's a disproportionate amount of power going to elites. And so you could argue that principally increasing voter turnout would decrease the problems that come with aristocracy. I think the more persuasive, if you're going for the policy side of things, is demographic-specific impacts, about how minority voters or minority representation in voting would be greatly improved by making voting compulsory. Young people would vote more frequently, which could be good because young people have the most to lose and the most to gain when decisions are made in government, because they will be alive for the longest amount of time to face the effects of government decisions. And then I also think there's great arguments about how centrist and moderate voters feel disenfranchised by politics, so they don't go out and vote, which makes it so that candidates on both sides of the aisle are really only trying to appeal to their base, or people that are farther left or farther right. And if everyone's voting, then now you have to worry about centrists and moderates, which is going to make more nuance in your policies and be able to create more working together, which is good. Second is state and local politics. Arguably the most important elections that happen in countries all across the world are local and state elections, because local politics will affect you much more, especially in really big countries like the United States, than decisions that are made at the federal level. There is even lower participation in local and state elections than there is in federal elections, which makes no sense when those elections have more of an effect on your daily life. So I think that you can have impacts that are specific to different regions or states. Like, you could make an Idaho argument about how the fact that nobody participates in Idaho local and state elections is really bad for Idaho's politics. It doesn't result in a high quality of candidates being selected. It means that stuff that majority of citizens wouldn't approve of still takes place because they don't even know how to make their voices heard, stuff like that. I think you could also argue that if we have more participation in voting for state and local politics, then we have more participation in people running for state and local politics, which could increase diversity in our government, both of people and ideas, and that could solve our problem with lack of diversity and homogeneity from the bottom up in government. Third is going to be increasing knowledge / interest / participation in politics in general. Uninformed voters or eligible voters who choose not to vote are really, really, really high in number. It's hundreds of millions of people who are not voting when they can, and knowing that you have to vote would bring it to the forefront of social discussion. The news headlines that would be generated when everyone is now required to vote would make it a huge deal in our society, would get people talking about it, and just knowing that you have to vote and that you and your friends, your family members, your coworkers, total strangers vote would make it something that we can all relate to each other on. I think that this could turn the uninformed voter argument that the negative might make, where they're going to say, oh, forcing people to vote will make uninformed voters vote, and that's bad. You could argue that if you know you have to vote, you're more likely to inform yourself before making that decision. Impacts could be more diverse candidates get picked, there's better representation, more people feel like the candidates actually can relate to them, and that they'll create better policies because we have more ideas. You can also argue that if you know more about politics, then you're more likely to run for office, and more participation with more candidates is good. Number 4 is more of a deontological argument that if you have a right, you also have a responsibility that comes with that right. And in the case of this topic, that would essentially say that if you have the right to vote, you also have the responsibility to vote. And that was kind of the definition that I read from the Idea Institute. Most democracies, in fact all democracies, if they're truly democracy, recognize a right to vote, but some also recognize a responsibility to vote, and they've decided to enforce that. So you could say that taking democracy or the freedoms that we have for granted is bad because it makes us less likely to stand up when our rights are being taken away, when we're just complacent. And so attaching responsibilities to our rights makes us more aware of what our rights are and makes us more aware of the freedoms that we do have. And so forcing people to vote would take their right to vote and also add a responsibility to it. And I think that this is a good way to answer the freedom to not vote arguments, because a lot of people are going to be persuaded by freedom, but if you argue that freedom is never free and freedom always comes with a responsibility, then I think that you can hedge your bets against those types of negative arguments a lot better. Fifth is voter suppression. I think that this is also a fantastic argument for the negative that I think, or for the affirmative, that you can read on more policy style and more value style cases. That a lot of different situations across the country are making voting difficult, like voter ID laws, lack of infrastructure at voting booths that makes it so people have to wait in lines for hours and hours, or they run out of ballots. And because it's not a federal holiday, people who have to work every single day that are living paycheck to paycheck, or even just people who can't take time off or they're going to get fired, might not be able to vote, and that specific group of people needs representation as well at the level of government to create policies that will help them. And you could argue that a logical step of implementation, if we're going to require people to vote, we're going to make sure that they can actually fulfill that responsibility. An example would be like jury duty, right? Like you have a right to be able to be on a jury, but you also have a responsibility to be on that jury if you get summoned for jury duty. And because of that, the government has created several policies that will help people fulfill that responsibility, such as the ability to notify your employer. Like you can tell your employer, I have to go to jury duty, sorry, and they can't fire you for that. And the government can also provide compensation for you participating in that. I think that you could combine this with arguments about minority voter turnout, about how minorities often feel disenfranchised by politics, so they choose not to vote, or when they want to vote because of suppression, can't vote. Sixth is going to be decreasing polarization / improving political campaigns. Everyone knows, I'm not the first person to tell you this, we are an extremely divided country right now, where many people feel like voting is pointless because they hate the candidates on both sides, at the primary level and at the general election level. And so that means that campaigns are currently only campaigning to people who they know will vote, which are people on the farther left and on the farther right than the general population. Whereas if we increased moderate voter turnout by making voting compulsory, then that means that candidates now have to appeal to everyone. They have to appeal to people on their own side, but they also have to appeal to people who are in the middle, who don't have a side, and people that are slightly to the right or slightly to the left of where they're at. That could improve policies by making it so our policies are more nuanced, and everyone knows that Congress does the vast majority of legislating, but when Congress is so divided on far left and far right, then nothing ever gets passed and nothing ever really improves. But if our candidates and their policies become more moderate, then it makes compromise more likely to occur, so good ideas, even if they have to be a little bit watered down, actually have a shot at passing. It would also save campaigns resources, because instead of spending money just encouraging people to vote in general, they could spend that money trying to appeal to people to vote for them in particular, which would make campaigns more efficient and allow them to go to more people and spread their messages more, rather than just saying voting in general is good. Now let's talk about negative value premises and criterions. I feel like those are, and obviously there are more arguments for the affirmative that I didn't talk about, and coming up with your own ideas is good, but as far as the literature goes and the heart of the literature, those are the main arguments that I found. But now let's talk about value and criterion for the negative side. So first is democracy, same thing as the AF, I'm not going to repeat myself. The only specific con that I want to point out to reading democracy on the neg is that it's the most likely AF value, and if it's the most likely AF value, then you're probably going to have the same value in a general number of debates, and having the same value as the AF can be bad because the 1AR gets a lot easier. If I know that in 4 minutes I can just be like, group the values, we agree, let's just talk about the criterion, I could be saving anywhere from 15 to 45 seconds in that debate just by not having to defend my value choice. And if you have the same value, you're more likely to have the same or similar criterions, and the last thing you want to do as the negative is give the AF an easier 1AR or an easier 2AR. Other than that, if you have multiple cases and the AF goes up and their value isn't democracy, then democracy is a fantastic value to read on the negative. Second, again, governmental legitimacy, it's pretty much the same thing here, but instead it could be good because you could argue that if we have compulsory voting, it would be terrible for governmental legitimacy because it would essentially say, oh, we are legitimate because everyone's voting. It would artificially solve the problem. It would artificially make it so that, oh, people think we should exist because they're voting for us. But if you have to vote or you're going to be punished, then whether or not you think the government is doing a good job has nothing to do with your right or with voting. As far as the cons go, I think that this can also be turned if you read this on the neg, because the government could say, if you're not forcing your citizens to vote, and the majority of your leaders didn't have the majority of your citizens actually vote for them, then under the second definition of governmental legitimacy, the positive definition, then it's impossible to determine. Third, social and societal welfare, I think it's the exact same thing for the reasons why it's good to read on the AF. If you're looking to have a more policy-based or utilitarian-based argument, then I think social and societal welfare is a pretty good one to read on the negative on this topic. Fourth is going to be liberty. Liberty could easily just serve as a criterion for one of the other values, but I think it's big enough that it could also serve as its own value. Lexico defines it as the state of being free within a society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. I think this is good because it's really specific. Nobody's going to be able to clock you for being too vague on your value. I think you could argue that because the topic is about democratic societies, one of the biggest, if not the biggest value in a democratic society is liberty. And I also think that you can tie a lot of deontological negative contentions back to it, whereas it's difficult to tie a lot of affirmative arguments back to liberty. If the AF is forcing you to do something, they're going to really struggle winning on liberty. Whereas you can make arguments about the freedom not to vote, or the right to protest as not voting, and stuff like that. Cons is I think that this could easily just be read as a criterion, so the other person might be able to just say your value isn't as important as mine because it's a smaller aspect of it. I think as well it's really hard to tie utilitarian impacts that are not directly about freedom back to liberty, so it might shrink the toolbox of possible contentions that you're allowed to read. Fifth and finally for the negative is human dignity. The Center for Bioethics and Human Dignity defines HD as the recognition that human beings possess a special value intrinsic to their humanity and as such are worthy of respect simply because they are human beings. This one kind of comes out of left field, but I feel like it could be really good for specific arguments that you might want to read on the neg, such as how forcing certain populations to vote for regimes they see as oppressive is bad, and deontological arguments that are about how, like, principles rather than direct consequences are really good under the value of human dignity, like we should always respect each individual human simply because they are human. The cons are that it's really not directly in the topic, and there aren't a lot of topical justifications for it, and there's also a limited number of negative arguments that will link back to it, so there are still great arguments, but it decreases the number of great arguments that you can read that are part of the topic and part of this criterion, or this value. For negative value criterions, under democracy, you can read liberty, equality, or recognition of government authority as crucial aspects of democracy. For governmental legitimacy, I think anti-authoritarianism is really good, and you could talk about how forcing people to vote for you is more likely to prop up current illegitimate systems, which could be bad. You could also use consent of the governed or social contract theory. Societal welfare, same as the AF. Liberty, you could talk about minimizing unjust control or proper deprivations of rights, which essentially says it's only okay to take away rights under certain circumstances, and then under this criterion, your contentions would basically be these circumstances where it's okay to remove rights do not exist, therefore it is not okay to take away your right to not vote. And then lastly, under dignity, I think you could use integrity or living true to yourself, autonomy or the right to self-govern, and then good versus ill will, or the idea that we should make decisions that have our best interest and other people's best interest in mind, and you could argue that voting for the topic would deny that. Lastly, in this lecture, I want to talk about negative arguments, or reasons why voting ought not be compulsory in a democracy. Number one is uninformed voters. I don't think this is quite as essential to negative strategy as, say, voter turnout is to the AF, but I think it's going to be a big argument that you're at least going to have to be ready for. Lots of people know nothing about politics or current events. Being in debate tells you that. The problem is being in debate also tells you and sometimes gives you a false sense of superiority or a false sense of just how uninformed other people are. So if you're going to make this argument, I think that you have to be careful, because sometimes people will construe, you don't agree with me, you're uninformed, or you disagree with me, you're uninformed. So I think you have to be really careful of that. But you could argue that if everyone has to vote, a significant people who don't vote currently are uninformed voters, and that's bad because when they start voting, it could cause different impacts. Number one is they'll vote for bad candidates. I think this is the least persuasive argument. I think lots of judges and even coaches would be offended by this argument, because if the right to vote has nothing to do with whether or not you're going to vote for who I want you to vote for, unless you're living in like North Korea, where your right to vote is only a right to vote for a specific person. The other two are much more persuasive. One is you could vote for candidates that don't have your best interest in mind. If I have to vote and I have no idea who I'm voting for, it's possible that I vote for people who have who don't have my best interest in mind, and my vote for them makes them more likely to win the election. Whereas had I not voted at all, I wouldn't have at least contributed to my own demise. And then the third one, this is also called donkey voting, like pin the tail on the donkey, where people will vote for random candidates, and when they vote for random candidates, they tend to not exactly vote random. They'll vote for a candidate they know nothing about, but they'll vote for them because they like the sound of their name, or it happened to be at the top of the ballot. And that can shape an election in ways that are really bad, especially when you look at, we only have 58% voter turnout in the United States. Increasing voter turnout by 30% by making it required could increase the number of random voters by hundreds of thousands or millions, and in close races, that could be enough to completely change the election, all based on the sound of a candidate's name or their position in the order of candidates on the ballot. Number 2 is the right not to vote. Basically what the title says, you would argue that the ability to vote or not vote is really important, and that you could argue whether or not you vote is just important as who you're voting for. You can say that not voting is good for several reasons, in addition to you have a right to not vote. You could say that when candidates are like, oh, voter turnout is down this year, that means that we have to do better. If everyone's voting, then you remove that incentive for politicians to improve. 2 is not voting can express anger and expose problems with the electoral system. Like, a lot of people will say, I'm not going to vote until the electoral college is gone because I feel like my vote doesn't matter as long as the electoral college exists. So if we get rid of that and force everyone to vote, then you can no longer draw attention in the same way to problems like the electoral college. And lastly, if you don't like any of the candidates that were picked, you can signal by not voting to the Democratic Party and the Republican Party that they need to do a better job at trying to reach voters like you. If you have to vote, then you remove that ability to send a signal to major political organizations through not voting. Number 3 is that it hurts campaigning. This is a good turn to the helps campaigning argument that we talked about in the AF, is that right now politicians have an incentive to try and increase voter turnout. Like, if I want to win this election, I already know that I have these people, but how am I going to beat my opponent? By growing the number of people that vote for me, and by growing the number of people that vote in general. If the same person that encourages you to vote is also running, then you'll be like, hey, they wanted me to vote, I'm going to vote for them. And they also might advocate for specific policies that will increase turnout for specific communities. Like, for example, right now, a lot of people have talked about how Joe Biden has changed his platform to have more policies that appeal to African American voters and Latino voters, and that Trump has been trying to do the same thing. Whereas if they know that everyone's voting, then they might not have those policies that benefit specific minority groups because they'll take them for granted instead. You could also argue that it incentivizes parties to pick candidates that people will vote for, even if party members don't love them, but will vote for them anyway because they have to vote for somebody. I think after 2016, for example, where it was probably the most I hate both candidates election in recent history, that people started thinking, hey, in the future, we need to pick candidates that people like, but if you completely remove people's ability to not vote in general, then it's going to continue being the same. Pick your poison, vote for whoever I hate the least. Number 4 would be the punishment and enforcement of compulsory voting is bad. And the reason why is you could back what we talked about earlier, where if the AF clarifies and cross-checks what enforcement mechanism they're going to use, you can make arguments about why their specific mechanism is bad. So if they say there's a fine, you can say that fines are frequently hurting minority and low-income people way more than they hurt other people, that voting or not voting would essentially become a pay-to-play system, which is really unfair. You could say that imprisonment is especially bad because of how overcrowded prisons are, or that prisons are really evil and unfair, or that this is way too big of a punishment to fit the crime of simply not voting. Like, the fact that I decided not to vote for my county commissioner shouldn't mean that I have to go to jail and can't provide for my family anymore. You could also argue that violating civil liberties is bad, especially if your value is liberty. You could say not only is violating my liberty to not vote bad, but taking away other liberties as punishment for voting, that's even worse. And then lastly, if they say that they would let individual countries make their own policies, then you get access to huge disadvantages where you say if some countries, like North Korea, for example, have compulsory voting and their punishment mechanism is if you don't vote or if you don't vote for the right person, you go to jail or you could be killed. some democracies will elect authoritarian leaders, even if that country is still a democracy. So you could argue leaving it up to each individual country means that some democracies will elect leaders that will make the punishment for not voting absolutely terrible, and then you can give examples of that, like North Korea. Next is a lack of infrastructure or problems with implementation. All of the reasons that the AF gave earlier for why voter suppression occurs and how maybe voting for the AF would fix that, you could argue, no, it wouldn't fix that. All of those things would still exist, except now they'd be even worse. People are already waiting hours and hours and hours in lines to vote, and if you double the number of people that are voting at your specific station, then you're going to be waiting even longer, maybe so long that you don't get to vote. And now, instead of, I've been waiting here for 3 hours, I'm just going to go home, it's, I've been waiting here for 3 hours, if I leave, then I might get fined or thrown in jail. You could also argue that if the AF says, no, I'm going to fix all of those problems with a specific plan, that they're being extra topical and that they're going beyond the resolution, which could be good ground for you on the negative. You could also read an economic impact about how in order to protect the safety of the election and to guarantee that voter suppression didn't occur, they would have to spend so much money that in the current economic and health crisis, the last thing the government needs is to be spending billions and billions and billions more dollars, which is what this would cost. Number 6 is mitigating the effects of increased voter turnouts on specific populations. I think this is a tricky argument, and I don't think that this argument is for everyone. A lot of people would hear this and be really upset, and a lot of people would hear this and think that this is fascinating and really like it. Essentially, you're arguing that there are more white people than other racial groups in the United States. White people make up about 76% of the population, but white people only made up about 60% of people who voted in the previous presidential election. So the argument is, if there are millions and millions more of white people, and white people are more likely than other racial groups to have prejudice against those other racial groups simply because they are in the majority and don't see those problems for themselves, when you make voting compulsory, then the number of people that have prejudices who have not been able to vote for candidates that would enforce those prejudices would drastically increase. And you could use that to combat arguments like, oh, if we made voting compulsory, then more minorities would vote and would vote for candidates that would try and help them. The number that would increase of minorities of voting, let's say it's 10 million, compare that to the 40 million white people that would start voting, would probably cancel out those effects or maybe even make that worse. This argument hasn't exactly been discussed directly in a lot of high literature, but you could string the arguments together using a lot of analytics, some evidence, and unfortunately lots of math, but I just think that this is at least an interesting way on the negative to answer arguments about like minority voter turnout. Number 7 is time frame or implementation specific arguments. I think if you're not about policy arguments, or if you don't think that this is a proposition of policy, you're probably not going to like this. The two that I thought of is coronavirus disad, where you say if we made voting mandatory right now, it would definitely increase the number of people voting in person, which would spread the disease more, and that could be really bad. Or it would force us to do way more mail-in voting, but that's bad because we don't have the infrastructure federally and nationally to both increase the number of people that are voting by millions and millions and millions, and also have all of those people vote by mail. And the impact that would be, it could delegitimize the election, it could cause the election to be dragged out, it could cause serious problems politically for the parties and for everyone involved. And the second one that I thought of is an election politics disad, where you essentially argue the fact that we're so close to an election, implementing a massive structural change to the way elections are done could drastically change the outcome of the election, and you would argue that change is bad on the negative. So it doesn't have to be necessarily Biden or Trump, it could also be Senate or House elections, where you say if everyone starts voting, then this specific state that might have flipped Democrat or that might have flipped Republican probably wouldn't flip, or would flip the opposite direction that we want it to, and that could be bad. These arguments are usually very political and are usually very politically biased, because the impact is usually doing the AF would cause Biden to win, which is bad, or doing the AF would cause Trump to win, which is bad, which is why I think this would only fly in front of a specific type of judge. But seeing as the topic is literally happening September, October, the 2 months before the election, I think it is incredibly politically relevant. And then numbers 8, 9, and 10 are counterplans. Again, if you don't think counterplans belong in LD, or your coach doesn't think they belong in LD, that is a totally valid opinion, and you can disregard this completely. But if you're cool with counterplans, or if you at least feel like I want to be ready for debating counterplans, here are some that I've thought of and that I've seen other people talking about. One is, instead of forcing everyone to vote by making voting compulsory, make automatic registration a thing. So instead of having to go through the hassle of registering to vote, and once you're registered, that's when you can get reminders. If you're not registered and you try to show up and vote, and your state doesn't have same-day registration, millions of people have been prevented from voting for that exact reason. So this counterplan would say we can solve the issues of voter suppression and voter turnout, at least in part, by automatically registering people. And then the net benefit is you don't have to limit people's rights or really any of the other negative contentions that we've talked about. Number 9 is the popular vote counterplan, which directly goes to the disenfranchisement argument that we talked about earlier. You can say the reason people aren't voting and the reason why people are being suppressed is because the popular vote doesn't exist. It's the Electoral College's fault. So you say we don't have to take away people's rights, or we don't have to cause the coronavirus issue, we don't have to cause all of these other problems. We can just get rid of the Electoral College, make it a popular vote, and that will resolve all of the issues that you're talking about, AF, without causing my negative contentions to occur. The 10th argument is a federal and state holiday counterplan, which would again resolve the issues around voter suppression and increase voter turnout, and would avoid the disadvantages of coronavirus, of compulsory voting. I think you could also just read a laundry list election reform counterplan and combine all 3 of these together. I think that would be really persuasive and would probably solve most of the AF's offense. The problem is, if you read that, this counterplan is going to take so long to read that you're going to have less time to read a good net benefit and less time to specifically attack parts of the AF. The last negative argument that I want to talk about is interesting, but I just was like, let's throw in kind of something crazy at the end for fun, and that is an age pick or an age plan-inclusive counterplan. So again, if you don't like counterplans or you don't like picks, you do not have to read this, but you should be ready for it. And that is, ask the affirmative in cross-X if voting would be compulsory for anybody over the democratic nation's age for gaining the right to vote. So, for example, if this were implemented in the United States, everyone over the age of 17 would be required to vote, like everyone who is 18 and older. And if the AF says no, then you can be like, that's not really compulsory, is it? And then make arguments about that. And if they say yes, then you could read a plan-inclusive counterplan that says, make it compulsory, but not for everybody, only people within a specific age group. So if you wanted to limit out people that are older than a certain age, the net benefit could be protecting older people from getting COVID at the election this election, or at the voting booth this election, or something about how the votes of younger people should matter more because the decisions that they make will affect them for longer. This is a great turn to the argument about how young voter turnout would increase, but if young voter turnout increases, so would older voter turnout. And so you could argue that for older people, voting should be a choice. And then you could also argue that we should make it, you have to be 18 to vote, but you shouldn't be required to vote until you're 20-something, and that way we don't have to worry about the problem with young voters not having experience or maturity or knowledge to make informed decisions. I personally, as a 20-year-old, hate this argument, but a lot of your judges, I think, would be incredibly persuaded by the idea that maybe young people should be allowed to vote, but they shouldn't be required to vote because that might not be a responsibility they're ready for yet. That is pretty much all the stuff that I have for this lecture. Thank you so much for watching. I know that this is probably a really long video. I can't exactly see a timer on it yet. But if you want me to make more of these in the future, if you have any specific questions, I will put my email address in the description box. And I hope that if any of us actually get to end up debating this topic in Idaho, we don't really have a lot of invitationals that occur during the September-October time period, but seeing as every day it looks like things are going to be online more and more, I figured that at least some of our students would be participating in online tournaments, and if they're not, then what a fantastic opportunity to practice your case writing abilities and to do practice debates with no pressure. So even if you're watching this going, I'm never going to debate this, you should debate it, you should practice debate it, you should research it, and you should write cases on it, because it's a no pressure opportunity to improve your skills at debate. Again, I'm Jet Smith. I'm the new head coach at Highland High School, and thank you so much for watching, and I will hopefully see you next time.